Okay, I'm wrapping up. I'll be home soon. Christie Wilson promised into her phone at 10:28 p.m. On the other end, her boyfriend Danny Burlando had no way of knowing these casual words would become the last he'd ever hear from her. No way to sense that this routine call on October 4th, 2005, would replay endlessly in his mind in the dark days to come. Their relationship had always carried this small tension: Danny's concern about her casino visits, Christie's assurances that she knew her limits. That evening, when she'd told him about her plans to play a few hands of blackjack at Thunder Valley Casino, he'd felt that familiar worry. But Christie was a natural with numbers, a whiz who could calculate odds and percentages as easily as breathing. At 27, she knew the game, knew the house, knew her way around the familiar hum of Thunder Valley's blackjack tables. The casino staff recognized her immediately that night, another evening of calculated risks, of wins and losses, of the electric thrill that kept drawing her back. She'd meant it to be quick, just a few hands, a brief escape from life's demands, then home to Danny. Nothing more than a typical night out. But something went terribly wrong after that final phone call. The security cameras would later reveal Christie leaving at 1:13 a.m., accompanied by a stranger from the blackjack tables. In that moment, she stepped out of the bright, controlled world of Thunder Valley Casino and into a darkness from which she would never return. Thunder Valley had always felt like a second home to Christie, a place where she could lose herself in the mathematics of chance, where the nights blurred into possibilities. Now it would become something else entirely, the last place anyone would see Christie Wilson alive, the starting point of a nightmare that would consume her loved ones for years to come. Danny's worries about her gambling suddenly seemed trivial compared to the horror that was unfolding. She had promised to come home. She had always come home before. But this time, the house wouldn't just take her money, it would take everything. Inside the casino, Christie was on a winning streak, her energy infectious to those around her. Other patrons at the table could sense her luck and joined in on the excitement. It wasn't long, though, before a new face appeared beside her, a slightly older man who slid into the seat next to her. He watched her play, and when their eyes met, he struck up a conversation. His name was Mario Garcia, a 53-year-old family man with thinning hair, glasses, and an unsettling charisma. Mario seemed friendly enough, flashing a smile as he talked to Christie, even putting his arm around her at one point. But Christie, feeling uncomfortable, brushed it off, keeping her focus on the game. As the night wore on, casino staff noted something peculiar. Christie seemed a bit off, not her usual upbeat self. Her movements were slightly more hesitant, her reactions a bit slower, as though something had shifted. Was she simply tired, or was there something more? The staff couldn't pinpoint it, but they began to watch her more closely. Some even considered asking her to leave, fearing she might have had too much to drink, though she hadn't consumed anything excessive. And then Mario stepped in, volunteering to keep an eye on her, a casual statement that, in hindsight, would carry an eerie weight. As the clock struck past 1 a.m., Christie gathered her things, seemingly ready to call it a night. Mario, still by her side, motioned for them to leave together, guiding her toward the casino doors. The surveillance cameras tracked their every step as they walked out into the night, toward the parking lot. This was the last anyone would ever see of Christie. Morning dawned with a stark silence. Christie's phone didn't ring back, and her car remained untouched in the casino parking lot. When Danny woke up, he was surprised and then quickly concerned. She hadn't come home, and calls to her phone went straight to voicemail. As the hours ticked by, his worry escalated, driving him to leave message after message, his voice becoming more frantic with each call. 10:15 on Wednesday. It's now been 24 hours since I talked to you last, and I'm worried sick about you. Please call me. If you're okay, call me. If you're not okay, call me. Let me know what's going on. By the following day, with no response and no sign of her, Danny reported Christie missing to the authorities. This was no casual disappearance. Christie had friends, a boyfriend, family. She had a life, one she wouldn't just abandon without reason. The police investigation began at Thunder Valley Casino, where they combed through hours of surveillance footage, hoping to unravel the mystery of Christie's last known hours. The footage offered a haunting glimpse: Christie walking out of the casino with Mario Garcia by her side, heading toward the parking lot, and then nothing. The camera showed Mario leaving alone in his car a few minutes later, looking untroubled, unhurried. It was as if Christie had simply vanished into the darkness. There was also the matter of Mario's appearance when detectives visited him just days later. He had noticeable scratches on his face and chest, fresh ones. When questioned, he shrugged them off, claiming he'd gotten into poison oak while doing yard work, or perhaps they were from a fall. But something about his explanation didn't sit right with Detective Murchison, who noted that the scratches appeared too uniform, too deliberate, like claw marks from someone desperately defending themselves. And then there was Mario's behavior itself. Rather than showing concern for Christie's welfare or attempting to assist in finding her, he appeared calm, evasive, even dismissive. Detectives approached Mario with questions, and he offered a rehearsed-sounding story. According to him, he and Christie had walked to his car, shared a brief, friendly hug, and then parted ways. He suggested that she might have decided to go back into the casino for her phone, or that she met someone else afterward. His version of events sounded plausible enough, but to Detective Don Murchison, who led the investigation, it was filled with holes. Mario's calm demeanor, the vague details, the convenient gaps in memory, it all seemed too convenient. In the days that followed, detectives began to piece together a portrait of Mario Garcia that no one could have anticipated. They started with the basics, conducting background checks, following up on leads, and interviewing those closest to him. What they uncovered was a history of violence, a pattern that dated back nearly 3 decades and left a trail of traumatized women who had crossed his path. Their investigation led them to Wendy Ward, a woman who had dated Mario in 1978. Back then, she had seen a different side of him: charming, attentive, a seemingly supportive partner. But that facade quickly crumbled when she tried to end their relationship. Wendy vividly recalled the night Mario turned on her, grabbing her roughly, his hands pressing against her throat as he dragged her into his van. He held her head in a vice grip, warning her, "You do anything, I'll take your head and smash it." Wendy fought back, clawing and scratching in a desperate bid to escape. He responded by choking her, driving her back to his apartment, and then, in a terrifying display of control, pulling out a gun and pressing it to her head before pulling the trigger. The gun was unloaded, but Mario's message was clear: he could kill her anytime he chose. He raped her again, made himself a sandwich, and then drove her home as though nothing had happened.
He was holding my neck, or he was holding my head. "I will take your head and I will smash it." I think he said to me, "Take off your clothes," or something like that. And I said no. Then he started to choke me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't breathe.
Wendy reported the attack, and while he was arrested, the charges were reduced. Mario spent only 18 months on probation. Wendy, on the other hand, would spend years dealing with the trauma of that night, a night she now feared had repeated itself with Christie. Investigators also uncovered the story of Lynette Smith, another woman Mario had dated after Wendy. Their relationship had its own share of turmoil, but Lynette, too, had tried to move on from Mario. One Christmas night, she and her mother, Violet, agreed to spend the holiday with him, driving in Lynette's car. Witnesses later reported seeing the car pull over suddenly before veering off the road into a waterway near the Oakland airport. The car sank, and while Mario managed to escape, both Lynette and her mother drowned. Mario claimed he'd panicked and escaped, assuming everyone else would too. He insisted that Lynette had been the one driving, but investigators found his version of events questionable. Mario hired a criminal lawyer and refused to cooperate further. And just as with Wendy's case, the incident left him with no more than a haunting suspicion and a clean record. He had walked away, his past unscathed, and Lynette's death, along with her mother's, became yet another disturbing thread in the growing tapestry of Mario's life. Back in 2005, as Detective Murchison pored over these stories, the picture of Mario Garcia was growing darker and more complex. To the outside world, he was a family man with a respectable job as a project manager at a local hospital. His wife Jean defended him fervently, describing him as a caring husband and father. His sons, Chris and Andy, also believed in their father, recalling fond memories of him teaching them to play baseball and helping with school projects. But beneath this veneer of normalcy was a man whose actions painted a picture of disturbing violence, a man who had repeatedly left women in peril, only to escape unscathed. The days turned into weeks, and the search for Christie Wilson grew increasingly desperate. Detective Murchison and his team scoured every inch of the Thunder Valley Casino's grounds and surrounding areas, yet they found no sign of her. Helicopters circled above, and teams of volunteers walked the rural roads, the empty fields, and every dark corner of the county in hopes of uncovering a trace of the young woman. But Christie remained a haunting mystery, gone without a single clue as to where she might be. With every fruitless search, the spotlight on Mario Garcia intensified. Detectives continued to press him, but his story didn't change. He maintained that he and Christie had simply walked to his car together, shared a quick hug, and then parted ways. The scratches on his face and chest were, he insisted, from a brush with poison oak or perhaps from a fall, nothing more. But to Murchison and his team, Mario's story was full of troubling gaps. His demeanor was calm, too calm, and his evasive answers and lack of genuine concern raised more questions than they answered. The question for investigators became impossible to ignore had Mario's violent past finally caught up with him, this time claiming the life of Christie Wilson. Mario's family, however, remained loyal. His wife, Jean Garcia, firmly believed in his innocence. To her, Mario was a loving husband, a devoted father to their sons Chris and Andy, and the cornerstone of their family. She described Mario as her destiny, the one who completed her and brought stability and happiness into her life. Their sons, still teenagers, recalled Mario's quiet strength, his support for their interests, and his consistent presence in their lives. To them, he was nothing like the man painted in police reports and witness accounts. But as investigators pieced together more of Mario's past, they saw a pattern that couldn't be ignored, a dangerous side hidden beneath the mask of a family man. One particularly haunting detail stood out. While Mario had appeared composed and calm in the days after Christie's disappearance, his face and chest bore scratches. These scratches, while minor, were anything but inconspicuous, especially to trained detectives like Murchison. To him, the marks were deliberate and telling, as if left by someone fighting for their life. Even more unsettling was Mario's insistence that they were merely from poison oak or a fall, despite the lack of any other injuries to support his claim. In the meantime, authorities worked around the clock, trying to follow every possible lead to locate Christie. Her mother, Debbie Boyd, refused to back down. She took each day in stride, battling the heartbreak with sheer determination. To Debbie, this was a war, and she was unwilling to lose. "I may be 5'1" and blonde," she said to the press, "but they just met a barracuda, and the fight's on." Her words resonated with every friend, family member, and investigator who joined the search, infusing them with a renewed sense of purpose and urgency. As the investigation continued, the team decided to take a closer look at Mario's car. Detectives hoped that the vehicle, which he had driven that night from the casino, might contain evidence linking him to Christie. What they found, however, was both promising and perplexing. While Mario's car appeared thoroughly cleaned, missing even its trunk mats, detectives were able to retrieve hairs from the trunk and a door handle that, upon closer inspection, matched samples from Christie's hairbrush. The odds of these hairs belonging to anyone else were astronomically low, a staggering 1 in 720 quintillion. To the detectives, this was no mere coincidence. It was evidence that Christie had been in Mario's car that night, as he had initially claimed. Alongside the hairs, detectives also found a faint, small blood stain on the back seat. Though it was too diluted for conclusive DNA analysis, the stain suggested something terrible had happened, a scuffle or a struggle that had left its mark, even on a surface Mario had tried so carefully to clean. For the team, each trace of evidence painted a picture that was becoming harder to ignore. Christie had likely fought to escape her fate in Mario's car, yet somehow he had managed to hide all traces of her after that night. Despite the evidence, Mario's story remained unchanged. In interviews, he suggested that perhaps Christie's boyfriend Danny was involved, or that she had met someone else after they parted ways at the casino. His attempt to deflect suspicion was unconvincing, particularly in light of his evasive demeanor and chilling history. As his explanations grew thinner, the case against him grew stronger. A significant break in the investigation came when detectives re-watched the surveillance footage from the casino. The footage, though grainy, showed Christie and Mario walking out together, her posture tense as she pushed his arm away when he tried to put it around her. The parking lot camera caught his car leaving just a few minutes later, but strangely, Christie's silhouette wasn't visible. If she was still with him, she would have been hidden, likely incapacitated. Detectives now suspected that Mario had driven in the wrong direction purposefully, taking her somewhere isolated, where he could finish what he'd started without interference. Their suspicions were further compounded by Mario's online search history. In the days following Christie's disappearance, he had looked up information on date rape drugs, forensic firearms evidence, and forensic toxicology. To the detectives, it was more than coincidence. It was a calculated effort to cover his tracks, to find a way to obscure whatever had happened that night. By now, the detectives were convinced that Mario had taken Christie's life, though they still lacked her body, the one piece of evidence that would seal their case. After weeks of searching, hoping against hope, the Placer County authorities made a difficult choice. In October, they moved forward with murder charges against Mario Garcia, even though they hadn't found Christie's remains. It was a bold step, but one they believed was necessary to bring justice to Christie's family. Prosecuting a no-body case was a daunting task, and the team knew it. They had to build their case on circumstantial evidence, on the chilling details of Mario's past, and on every trace they'd found in his car. But each piece of evidence told the same story: Christie hadn't simply vanished, she had been taken. The trial date was set, and the courtroom filled with Christie's family, friends, and supporters, as well as those curious to see how this haunting case would unfold. Mario's attorney argued that there was no proof of Christie's death, suggesting she might still be alive, somewhere out of reach. But to the jury, the tale told by the prosecution was too powerful to ignore. The defense's argument that Christie could still be alive rang hollow against the overwhelming evidence: the hair samples, the blood stain, and the history of violence. As the trial unfolded, an unexpected supporter joined Christie's family: Wendy Ward. Now in her 50s, Wendy had spent years rebuilding her life after her terrifying encounter with Mario, only to be confronted once again with the memory of his violent streak. She couldn't bear to stay silent, not while another woman's family suffered. Wendy met Christie's mother, Debbie, and the two embraced, finding strength and solidarity in their shared pain. In the end, Mario Garcia was found guilty of murder. The sentence came down in January 2007, and he was given 59 years to life, a decision that brought some measure of peace to Christie's family. But one question lingered: where was Christie? For Debbie Boyd, the mystery of her daughter's final resting place was a wound that remained open, an unanswered plea for closure. In the aftermath of the trial, she stood outside the courthouse, addressing reporters with an unyielding determination. "Now, if he's any kind of man, he'll tell us where he disposed of my daughter," she said, her voice strong, even as tears welled in her eyes. But Mario, even in his sentencing, remained silent. He would go to prison without revealing a single detail about what he'd done with Christie's body, leaving her family in a painful limbo. For Debbie, Danny, Tiffany, and the rest of Christie's loved ones, life became a series of unanswered questions, each one more painful than the last. Years passed, and Mario's appeals would drag the case back into the public eye time and again. Every time a new hearing was announced, every time he sought to reduce his sentence, the family was forced to relive the trauma, to face the truth that justice had come but without closure. And with every appeal, Debbie's resolve grew stronger. She was determined not to let Mario Garcia use her daughter's life or her memory as a bargaining chip. In 2017, Debbie, still longing for answers, reached out to Mario in a last attempt to learn the truth. In his response, he apologized not for his crime but for what she'd been through. He hinted that he might reveal details if his sentence were reduced. But as the words sank in, Debbie realized that this man, who had taken everything from her, would never show remorse. The idea of striking a deal felt unbearable, and with a heart as fierce as it was broken, she resolved to find Christie on her own terms. For 15 years, Christie Wilson's disappearance weighed heavily on her family, particularly on her mother, Debbie Boyd. Her daughter's absence was a wound that time only deepened, a constant reminder of the horrific events that had torn Christie from her life and left her loved ones in a seemingly endless search for answers. Every appeal Mario Garcia filed, every passing year without a trace, kept Debbie in a painful limbo. But through it all, she remained steadfast, refusing to give in to despair. Her mission was clear: bring Christie home, no matter how long it took or how grueling the journey. Detectives Don Murchison and Nuno Tavares, who had been on Christie's case since the beginning, felt the same resolve. They had seen Mario Garcia's violent past, his lack of remorse, and the trail of broken lives left in his wake. To them, bringing Christie home was more than just a case, it was a promise to her family, a final piece of justice that needed to be delivered. In 2017, their investigation gained renewed momentum when local journalist Tony Lopez interviewed Debbie. Her words and emotional plea to understand why Mario had become the man he was sparked an unexpected response. Shortly after the interview aired, Mario reached out to Debbie. He wrote her a letter, apologizing not for what he'd done to Christie, but for the suffering Debbie had endured. He hinted that he might be willing to share information about Christie's location in exchange for a reduced sentence, hoping to use Debbie's desperation to his advantage. But Debbie saw through him. She understood that any remorse he showed was shallow, that his aim was self-preservation, not atonement. Resolving to hold on to her dignity and her daughter's memory, Debbie rejected his offer. "He will not use my daughter's body as a bargaining chip," she stated with a strength that had carried her through more than a decade of heartache. The case had seemingly reached a dead end, but detectives Murchison and Tavares weren't ready to give up. They decided to revisit Mario's family, sensing there might be clues hidden within the memories of those closest to him. By now, Jean Garcia, Mario's wife, had divorced him, shaken by the weight of his conviction and the damning evidence. She no longer believed his claims of innocence. When detectives approached her, they found she was willing to cooperate, even hoping they might find answers for Christie's family. Their next visit was with Mario's sons, Chris and Andy, both of whom had lived with their father at the time of Christie's disappearance. The detectives walked them through the days following October 5, 2005, hoping they might recall something important. As they recounted those days, a memory resurfaced for Chris. He remembered his father acting strangely, working frantically on their property with a tractor near a detached garage, his expression tense, as if he were carrying out a task that weighed heavily on him. Chris remembered thinking it was unusual, especially when his father refused to attend Chris's soccer game that day, something he rarely missed. Chris agreed to accompany detectives to the old property, which the family had vacated in 2007 after Mario's conviction. He pointed them to the area by the detached garage, where he remembered seeing his father's frantic work. It was a quiet, isolated part of the 5-acre property, just over 100 yards from the house. As they stood there, a sense of foreboding filled the air. This was a place that had held dark secrets for too long. Detectives Murchison and Tavares knew they needed a more thorough approach than before. Back in 2005, search teams had covered the property using cadaver dogs, but the dogs had found nothing conclusive. In 2020, with advancements in technology, the detectives brought in a company specializing in ground-penetrating radar. Over several days, they painstakingly scanned nearly the entire property, hoping to uncover what lay hidden beneath the surface. The GPR analysis highlighted 8 potential voids or pockets in the ground that could contain human remains. The team dug at the first 2 locations with bated breath, but found nothing. The disappointment was palpable, but they pressed on. On the 3rd attempt, they struck something just a few inches below the surface. A bone emerged from the ground. Murchison's heart pounded as he looked closer, barely daring to hope. More bones appeared, and finally a near-complete skeleton surfaced, confirming their deepest fears. The remains were carefully removed, analyzed, and in August 2020, the dental records confirmed the identity. It was Christie Wilson. When detectives informed Debbie, they did so in person, flying to her home to deliver the news with the respect she deserved. The moment was surreal. After years of heartache, Debbie stood frozen, processing the revelation that she'd both longed for and dreaded. "Is it okay to feel happy?" she whispered, her emotions tangled between grief and relief. Her husband, Pat, held her tightly, both of them struck by a profound sense of closure and peace. Christie was finally coming home. For Murchison and Tavares, this was the end of a journey they had dedicated themselves to with unwavering resolve. Murchison later said, "We never gave up on trying to find Christie. We looked for her for 15 years. Her family trusted us with the most precious thing they had." The recovery of Christie's remains brought a wave of closure to those who loved her. Her friend Tiffany, who had mourned in silence for so long, finally felt her grief validated. For Danny Burlando, Christie's boyfriend, the discovery reopened wounds that had never truly healed, but he took solace in knowing she could be laid to rest. Even Mario's sons, Chris and Andy, found a measure of peace in knowing they had helped bring closure to Christie's family. They had carried the heavy knowledge of their father's crimes for years, a burden they never asked for but couldn't escape. As Detective Tavares reflected, they didn't ask to have a dad and a husband who was a murderer, who buried his victim on their property, where they lived and played. They didn't ask for that. Chris and Andy, though deeply scarred, expressed gratitude that they could offer some answers to Christie's family, even if it meant facing the truth about their father. For Debbie, there was a bittersweet victory in knowing she had finally brought her daughter home. She took Christie's ashes to Capitola Pier, a place Christie had loved and called her happy place. Debbie scattered her ashes there, in a final act of love, returning Christie to a spot that had always brought her joy. She later reflected, "This is a day of peace, a peace we haven't had. We are so happy to finally close this chapter of torment." Though her loss would never truly heal, the question that had haunted her nights for 15 years was finally answered.
My life changed, my family's life changed, and it was a peace that came over me that I hadn't had for 15 years.
Mario Garcia, meanwhile, would never face Debbie's relief. In December 2020, just a few months after Christie's remains were discovered, he passed away in prison from pneumonia complications related to COVID-19. He took his secrets to the grave, never once admitting guilt, never expressing a shred of remorse. His silence left an emptiness, but it was a void that Christie's loved ones could now fill with memories of her, free from the endless, agonizing search for the truth. Christie's story became a symbol of resilience, love, and justice fought for through unimaginable loss. Debbie, Detective Murchison, and Detective Tavares demonstrated that even in the face of insurmountable odds, truth and justice could prevail. As Debbie looked out over the pier, her daughter's spirit surrounded her, forever bound to the gentle waves and the warmth of a mother's unbreakable love. Christie Wilson's memory would live on, no longer a haunting question, but a lasting legacy of a life and a family that had found peace at last.